I can't take it anymore. Every single day, that woman parks her luxury SUV on my perfectly maintained lawn. After 23 years serving this community as a police officer, risking my life to protect people like her, this is the respect I get. I've asked nicely. I've left notes. I've even tried reasoning with her face to face. Nothing works. She just smirks and walks away, telling me I should be grateful she chose to park near my little house. Well, today everything changes. I've given her every chance to do the right thing. Now she's going to regret ever crossing my path. Karen, if you're listening, this is your final warning. My patience has run out. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories about standing up to entitled people who think rules don't apply to them, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. 6 months ago, I finally achieved my lifelong dream. After decades of service with the Chicago Police Department, I retired with full honors and purchased a small but beautiful house in the suburbs. The neighborhood was exactly what I'd always wanted: peaceful, friendly, with well-kept lawns and families who waved when you walked by. My name is Marcus Johnson, and at 55 years old, I thought I'd finally earned my slice of the American dream. My house wasn't the biggest on the block, but it was mine, paid for with years of night shifts, overtime, and dangerous situations most people couldn't imagine. The front yard was what really sold me on the place. A lush, green carpet of grass that I immediately took pride in maintaining. Every morning, I'd wake up with the sun, make my coffee, and sit on my porch admiring that lawn while planning my day. Simple pleasures after a lifetime of chaos. 3 weeks after moving in, I noticed tire marks cutting across the corner of my lawn. First, I thought it was an accident. Maybe someone had taken a turn too sharply. I raked the damaged grass, preceded it, and went about my business. But the next day it happened again, and the day after that. Always in the same spot, always around the same time. I set up a small camera on my porch, disguised as a birdhouse. The footage showed a white Range Rover deliberately cutting across my corner lot to make a shortcut into the cul-de-sac behind my house. The driver wasn't even in a hurry. She just couldn't be bothered to drive the extra 20 seconds around the block. The following afternoon, I waited on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee. Right on schedule, the Range Rover appeared and began to turn onto my lawn. I raised my hand and stepped forward, signaling for the driver to stop. The window rolled down, revealing a blonde woman in her 40s, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, an annoyed expression on her face. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said, using my most professional police voice. "I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't drive across my lawn. It's causing damage to the grass." She looked me up and down, taking in my dark skin, my graying hair, my simple clothes. "This is a shortcut everyone uses. I'm just going to my friend's house back there. I understand, but this is private property. There's a perfectly good road that goes around." She rolled her eyes. "It's just grass. Don't make such a big deal about it." Before I could respond, she rolled up her window and accelerated, her tires digging deeper into my lawn as she drove away. I stood there, speechless. In all my years on the force, I'd encountered my fair share of entitled individuals, but something about this woman's dismissive attitude hit me differently. This was my home, my sanctuary after decades of serving a city that often didn't appreciate its officers. I wasn't going to let someone disrespect it, or me. The next day, I installed a small decorative fence along the perimeter of my lawn. Nothing excessive, just wooden posts connected by a single chain, enough to make a statement that this was private property. I'd barely finished setting the last post when the white Range Rover appeared. The woman slowed down, stared at the fence, then honked her horn impatiently. I walked over to her car. "Good afternoon. As you can see, I've put up a fence to protect my property. Remove it now." Her voice was cold. "You can't block access like this." "I'm not blocking any public access. This is my private lawn. The road goes around the block. Do you know who my husband is?" She leaned forward. "He's Richard Cartwright. The Richard Cartwright, District Attorney's Office. One call from me, and you'll regret this little fence of yours. I dealt with these tactics before. people throwing around connections, making threats. But I was retired now. I wasn't a cop who had to worry about political pressure from above. Nam, I don't care if your husband is the president. This is my property, and you are not driving across it anymore. Her face flushed red. We'll see about that. She threw her car into reverse, backed up with a screech of tires, and drove away. That evening, I received a visit from 2 police officers, young guys I didn't recognize. They explained they'd received a complaint about an aggressive confrontation and threatening behavior. I invited them in, showed them my retired badge, explained the situation, and walked them through the footage from my camera. They seemed embarrassed to have been sent on such an errand. Sorry to bother you, sir, the younger one said. We had to follow up on the complaint, but we can see what's going on here. No problem, officers. I've been in your shoes. I walked them out, and as they were leaving, added, just so you know, the complainant mentioned she's married to Richard Cartwright from the DA's office. The older officer paused. Richard Cartwright retired 2 years ago. Moved to Florida from what I heard. I nodded, not surprised. Thought that might be the case. The next morning, I found my fence broken. The chain had been cut in several places, and tire tracks crossed my lawn again, deeper than before. The camera footage showed the Range Rover deliberately running over the chain, the woman driving slowly as if to savor the moment. I fixed the fence, this time using steel posts cemented into the ground and heavier chain. I also added a clear no trespassing sign, citing the relevant local ordinance. For good measure, I installed a brighter motion sensing light and a second camera with better resolution. 2 days passed without incident. I thought perhaps she'd gotten the message and found another route. Then came the weekend. I was enjoying my morning coffee when I heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine revving too high. The Range Rover came barreling down the street and didn't even slow as it crashed through my reinforced fence. The woman was actually smiling as she deliberately drove in a circle on my lawn, tearing up the grass, before exiting through the broken fence and continuing down the street. The damage was extensive. Deep tire ruts, broken fence posts ripped from the concrete, mud splattered across my walkway. As I surveyed the destruction, a neighbor from across the street came over. I saw the whole thing, said Mrs. Patel, a retired schoolteacher who had been among the first to welcome me to the neighborhood. That was Heather Montgomery, lives in the big house on Oakwood Drive. Her husband's some hotshot at a finance company, and she thinks it gives her the right to do whatever she wants. Heather Montgomery, I repeated, committing the name to memory. She's the worst, Mrs. Patel continued, always parking in handicapped spots even though there's nothing wrong with her, cutting in line at the grocery store, treating service workers like they're beneath her. Nobody stands up to her because her husband donates to all the local politicians' campaigns. I thanked Mrs. Patel for the information and spent the rest of the day repairing what I could of my yard. That night, I did some research. Heather Montgomery was indeed married to a senior executive at a Chicago investment firm. They had moved to the neighborhood 3 years ago and built one of the largest houses in the area. A search of public records showed multiple complaints against her noise violations, parking tickets that were mysteriously dismissed, even a case of alleged assault on a supermarket employee that never went to court. The next morning, I drove to the local hardware store and purchased several no trespassing signs, which I placed prominently around my property. I also bought materials to repair my fence again, this time with concrete-filled steel posts and heavy-duty chain. As an extra measure, I added a row of large decorative boulders along the corner of my lawn. Not enough to be dangerous, but certainly enough to discourage driving across. When I finished, I stood back to admire my work. The property was secured, the signs were visible, and the camera was recording. I'd done everything by the book, just as I'd been trained. That afternoon, the Range Rover returned. Heather Montgomery slowed to a stop, staring at my renovated defenses. For a moment, I thought she might try to ram through again, but even she could see that would damage her expensive vehicle. Instead, she rolled down her window. "You think this is going to stop me?" she called out. "This is just the beginning. You're going to wish you never moved here." I walked calmly to her car. "Mrs. Montgomery, I've documented all of your trespassing and vandalism. I have it on video. I filed police reports. If you continue to harass me or damage my property, I will pursue legal action. Against me?" She laughed. "Good luck with that. Do you have any idea how much lawyers cost? My husband keeps 3 on retainer. I spent 23 years as a police officer in Chicago. I know how the law works, and I know plenty of people in the legal system who owe me favors." Something in my tone must have registered, because her smirk faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "We'll see about that." She drove away, taking the long way around the block. For 2 weeks, things were quiet. No Range Rover, no damage to my property. I began to think the conflict had ended. I was out front, planting new grass seed in the areas that had been torn up, when Mrs. Patel hurried across the street. "Marcus," she said, slightly out of breath. "I just heard from Linda, who works at the township office. Heather Montgomery filed a complaint against your fence and boulders, claiming they're violating some neighborhood code. There's going to be an inspection tomorrow." I thanked her for the warning. I wasn't particularly worried. I knew I hadn't violated any codes. But it was clear that Heather Montgomery wasn't finished with her campaign against me. The inspector arrived the next morning, a tired-looking man in his 60s who introduced himself as Ray. He glanced at my property, then at his clipboard. "Got a complaint about non-conforming structures and hazardous landscaping," he said. I walked him around the property, showing him the fence, the boulders, the signs. "Everything is on my property, within the setback requirements. The fence is under the height that would require a permit, and the boulders are decorative landscaping." Ray nodded, making notes. "Mind if I ask why you've got all this set up? Most folks in this neighborhood don't bother with fences." I showed him the camera footage of Heather Montgomery driving across my lawn and demolishing my previous fences. His eyebrows rose higher with each clip. "That's the Montgomery woman, isn't it? Had run-ins with her before." He shook his head. "Not. Everything here is up to code. I'll mark the complaint as unfounded. But between you and me, she's not going to stop." "I appreciate the heads up," I said, walking him back to his truck. 20 years doing this job, and some people still surprise me with how entitled they can be." He climbed into his vehicle. "Good luck." That evening, I was watching the news when I heard a crash outside. I rushed to the window in time to see the white Range Rover speeding away. On my lawn lay the broken remains of my mailbox, clearly deliberately run over. The metal post was bent at a sharp angle, the box itself crushed. I went outside to assess the damage. The mailbox was destroyed, but more concerning was what I found inside it. A handwritten note that read, "This is just the beginning. Sell your house and leave. You don't belong here." The threat was clear, and the racial implication wasn't subtle. I photographed the note, the damaged mailbox, and checked my cameras. Unfortunately, they weren't angled to capture the mailbox clearly, but they did show the Range Rover approaching and leaving. I filed another police report the next day, including the threatening note. The officer who took my statement seemed genuinely concerned, but warned me that without clear video of Heather Montgomery placing the note or damaging the mailbox, it would be difficult to prove. "We'll send someone to talk to her," he assured me. But these kinds of cases can be hard to prosecute. I understood his position. I'd been on his side of the desk countless times, explaining to victims why the law couldn't help them as much as they deserved. But understanding didn't make it any less frustrating. That night, I sat on my porch, thinking about my options. I could sell the house and move, as the note suggested. I could escalate the legal battle, hiring lawyers and pushing for restraining orders. I could install more cameras, more lights, more barriers. None of these solutions felt right. In my years on the force, I'd learned that some people only respond when they experience consequences that affect them personally. Heather Montgomery clearly believed she was untouchable, that her husband's money and connections would shield her from any real repercussions. She needed to learn otherwise. The next day, I drove to a specialized security store in downtown Chicago. I'd worked with the owner, Frank, on several cases during my career. He greeted me warmly, and I explained my situation. "I need something that will protect my property but won't harm anyone," I said. Something legal but effective. Frank thought for a moment, then led me to the back of his store. I might have just the thing. He showed me a set of retractable security posts, the kind used to control vehicle access in parking garages and secure facilities. They were designed to be installed in the ground, remaining flush with the surface until activated, at which point they would rise about 2 feet. They're completely legal on private property, Frank explained. They're used by businesses all over the city. They can be set to raise and lower on a timer or controlled remotely. They won't damage a vehicle unless someone tries to drive over them when they're raised. And that would be the driver's fault, not yours. I examined the posts. They were perfect, unobtrusive when lowered, impossible to miss when raised, and designed specifically to control vehicle access without causing harm unless someone deliberately ignored them. I'll take 4, I said. Frank helped me load them into my truck. Just be careful with the installation. They need to be set in concrete, and you'll want to run the wiring properly. I spent the next week preparing. I dug 4 holes at strategic points along the corner of my lawn where Heather Montgomery usually drove across. I poured concrete bases, installed the posts, and ran the electrical wiring underground back to my garage, where I set up the control panel. I carefully covered the installations with sod, making them invisible when retracted. I also added something extra, a motion sensor that would trigger a small camera whenever the posts were activated, ensuring I'd have footage of any incidents. Finally, I installed a clear sign at the edge of my property that read, "Yanning. Vehicle barriers in use. Do not attempt to drive on lawn." With everything in place, I waited. 3 days passed with no sign of the Range Rover. On the 4th day, as I was tending to my garden, I heard the familiar engine. Heather Montgomery had returned. She slowed as she approached my house, eyeing the corner where she usually cut across. The fence was gone, the boulders had been moved to another part of the yard, and there was only a small warning sign that she likely couldn't read from her car. She must have thought I'd given up. I stood up slowly, making sure she saw me. Our eyes met. She smiled triumphantly and turned her wheel toward my lawn. I didn't run to stop her. I didn't shout a warning. I simply reached into my pocket and pressed the remote control. Just as the front tires of her Range Rover reached the edge of my lawn, the 4 security posts rose silently from the ground, now clearly visible at about 2 feet high. She had a moment to register their presence. Plenty of time to stop if she'd been driving carefully. Instead, she accelerated. The sound of metal striking metal rang out, followed by the hiss of escaping air as both front tires made contact with the posts. The Range Rover lurched forward a few more feet before coming to a complete stop, now clearly stuck with 2 flat tires, half on my lawn and half on the street. Heather Montgomery sat frozen behind the wheel for a moment, then threw her door open and stormed out. Her face was contorted with rage as she surveyed the damage. Both front tires were completely flat, and there appeared to be damage to the undercarriage of her vehicle. "What have you done?" she screamed, marching toward me. "You're going to pay for this. I'm calling the police right now." I remained calm. I'd be happy to explain the situation to them. "I have video of you trespassing on my clearly marked private property and ignoring the warning signs about the security measures in place." Security measures? Those things weren't there before. She pointed wildly at the posts, which remained raised. "They were installed last week, and there's a clearly posted warning sign right there." I pointed to the sign at the edge of my property. "I have the permits and documentation for their installation. You did this on purpose. You were waiting for me." I installed legal security measures on my private property after repeated trespassing and vandalism incidents, all of which are documented. If you had respected my property rights and obeyed the no trespassing signs, your vehicle would be undamaged. She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling my husband. You have no idea what's coming to you." While she made her call, I took out my own phone and reported the incident to the police. "I'd like to report a trespassing incident on my property that has resulted in damage to the trespasser's vehicle," I explained to the dispatcher. "The driver appears to be agitated, so officers should be aware of the situation." Heather Montgomery was now shouting into her phone, pacing back and forth. I could hear her demanding that her husband do something, and make this go away. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Patel and several others stood on their lawns, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording. The police arrived 15 minutes later, the same two officers who had responded to Heather's complaint about me weeks earlier. They surveyed the situation, noting the Range Rover with its flat tires perched half on my lawn, the raised security posts, and the warning sign. "Officers, this man set a trap for me," Heather declared before they could speak. "He installed those spikes to damage my car." "They're not spikes, ma'am," the older officer said, examining the posts. "They're standard security bollards, like the ones in front of government buildings. I don't care what they're called. He put them there to damage my car." "Mr. Johnson," the younger officer turned to me. "Could you explain what happened here?" I walked them through the situation, showing them the warning sign, the documentation for the bollards, and then pulling up the video footage on my phone, which clearly showed Heather Montgomery deliberately driving onto my lawn despite having time to stop when the posts rose. "This follows weeks of her trespassing and damaging my property," I explained, then showed them the footage of her previous incursions, the broken fences, and the destroyed mailbox. The older officer nodded. "And you have permits for these security measures?" I provided the paperwork Frank had helped me acquire, showing that the bollards were legally installed on my private property. "This all seems in order," the officer said, reviewing the documents. He turned to Heather. "Ma'am, it appears you were trespassing on private property and ignored posted warnings about security measures." "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "He can't just put things in the ground to damage cars." "Actually, property owners are permitted to install security measures on their private property, provided they're properly marked and documented, which these appear to be," the officer explained patiently. "If you felt the property had unsafe conditions, you should have reported it to the township, not driven across it. My husband will have both your badges for this," she threatened, pointing at the officers. "He's on his way here now." As if on cue, a black Mercedes pulled up, and a middle-aged man in an expensive suit emerged. He rushed over to Heather, then took in the scene with obvious dismay. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Mr. Montgomery, I presume," I said. "Your wife was trespassing on my property and damaged her vehicle on my legally installed security measures." He looked from me to the officers to the Range Rover, then back to his wife. "Heather, what did you do?" "Me?" she exclaimed. "He's the one who put those things in the ground. He trapped me." Mr. Montgomery closed his eyes briefly, as if summoning patience. "Officers, what's the situation here?" The older officer explained the circumstances again, showing him the documentation and video evidence. As he watched the footage of his wife repeatedly driving across my lawn and destroying my property over the past weeks, Mr. Montgomery's expression darkened. "So," the officer concluded, "based on the evidence, your wife was trespassing on clearly marked private property. Mr. Johnson's security measures are legal and properly documented. You're welcome to consult with an attorney, but I should warn you that Mr. Johnson would be within his rights to press charges for the previous incidents of trespassing and vandalism." Mr. Montgomery straightened his tie and turned to his wife. "Heather, wait in my car." His tone left no room for argument, though she tried to protest. "Now, Heather." After she stormed off to his Mercedes, he turned to me. "Mr. Johnson, I want to apologize for my wife's behavior. I had no idea this was going on." He ran a hand through his hair. "What would it take to resolve this situation amicably?" I considered for a moment. "I'm not interested in pressing charges or pursuing legal action, Mr. Montgomery. All I've ever wanted was respect for my property and to be left in peace." He nodded. "I understand. I'll pay for any damages to your lawn and property, of course, and I can assure you, there will be no further incidents. That's all I ask," I said, extending my hand. He shook it firmly. "I'll have the Range Rover towed immediately, and again I apologize." The officers, satisfied that the situation was under control, prepared to leave. "Mr. Johnson," the younger one said quietly, "I have to say, This was a pretty elegant solution to the problem. I smiled. Sometimes people only learn when they experience consequences firsthand. After everyone had left, Mrs. Patel crossed the street to join me. "That was quite a show," she said. "I don't think I've ever seen Heather Montgomery speechless before." "It wasn't about teaching her a lesson," I said, though part of me knew that wasn't entirely true. "It was about protecting what's mine." "Well, word is going to spread quickly. I doubt anyone else will be driving across your lawn anymore." The next morning, I woke to find a landscaping crew working on my lawn. The foreman explained that Mr. Montgomery had hired them to repair all damage and improve the entire front yard. They resodded the torn areas, planted flowers along the walkway, and installed a proper decorative fence that matched the aesthetic of the neighborhood, while clearly marking my property line. A week later, a formal letter arrived from Mr. Montgomery. It contained another apology, a check that more than covered any expenses I'd incurred, and news that Heather had begun therapy for anger management issues. He also mentioned that they would be attending the next neighborhood association meeting and hoped I would join them. I did attend that meeting, where Mr. Montgomery publicly apologized for his wife's behavior. Heather wasn't present, but I heard from Mrs. Patel that she had been volunteering at the local community center as part of her personal growth journey. As for the security bollards, I had them removed once the new fence was installed. They had served their purpose. My lawn returned to being just a lawn, a simple pleasure that I could enjoy without conflict. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't about revenge or teaching someone a lesson. It's about establishing boundaries and ensuring those boundaries are respected. After years of serving a community as a police officer, I had learned that justice comes in many forms. For Heather Montgomery, it came in the form of 2 flat tires and a public reckoning with her behavior. For me, it came in the form of a peaceful lawn and the quiet acknowledgement from my neighbors that I wasn't someone who could be pushed around. In the end, what Heather Montgomery never understood was that respect isn't something you demand because of who you are or what you own. It's something you earn by how you treat others. And sometimes, the most effective lessons come when people who have never faced consequences finally have to pay for their actions. As I sit on my porch each morning now, enjoying my coffee and my undisturbed view, I think about how we all need boundaries in our lives. We need to know where the lines are drawn, not just for others, but for ourselves too. Heather Montgomery had lived without boundaries for too long, and it had made her smaller, not larger. In forcing her to recognize mine, perhaps I had helped her begin to find her own. The neighborhood is peaceful now. The white Range Rover takes the long way around the block, and my lawn, my simple, hard-earned piece of the American dream, remains exactly as it should be, mine.